Regardless of what happens at Sunday's elections, it is true that East German politics has fundamentally changed from where it began in 1990. And in this video, I want to take a quick historical analysis of the way that the East German political environment and political landscape has changed over the past 35 years. I want to take a look at the three states in particular that are holding elections this September and see how they've voted since 1990, how it's changed, and how the different parties have done in various elections. I want to also take a look at the first elections in East Germany before it officially became part of the Federal Republic in 1990 for the Volkskammer, and this was a very interesting election. And this was basically an election that was held after the collapse of the communist government in East Germany. They lost power after opening the wall, and there was a kind of swift change in power, and they decided to hold their first open, completely democratic elections, and the Christian Democratic Union and its political allies won a sweeping landslide victory, combined winning around 48% of the vote, nearly winning an absolute majority. The Social Democrats won second place with 22% of the vote, followed by the Party of Democratic Socialism, the predecessor to Die Linke, which was the successor to the East German Socialist Unity Party, which was the Communist Party that governed East Germany from 1949 to 1989. That party came, or its successor rather, the PDS, came in third place with 16.4%, followed by various liberal and green associations and parties that did around 1 to 5%. Now, this election was very decisive. It gave the CDU a major victory. It was not only a victory for the CDU in East Germany in the new states, it was also a victory for the CDU in the West. Helmut Kohl, as the chancellor, had made this a part of his campaign to unify Germany. The CDU had made that a part of their political identity, and it still remains today a part of the legacy of the CDU that they were the party that managed to achieve unification. They were the party in government in both West Germany and in East Germany. What's important to note is this election determined the East German legislature as its own country. So even after East Germany had decided its new parliament that had replaced the communist government after they lost power, it was still its own country. And what happened was over the next several months, the CDU, along with other parties like the SPD, reformed East Germany to make it compatible for reunification. So they basically abolished the state institutions to allow it to be kind of combined into and integrated into the German Federal Republic. Of course, the Party of Democratic Socialism being the successor to the SED, a more moderate one for a democratic environment. A lot of the old guard had left the party or been expelled from it and had been taken over by a new, youth wing of the leadership, mainly led by Gregor Gysi, Hans Mottoro, and others. They, of course, were still very loyal to the old system, and they were opposed to it. But of course, with only 16% and a few allies amongst other parties, they did not muster enough support to prevent reunification from happening in the way it did. So we see the CDU from the beginning was very dominant here. And if we take a look at the map, we can see that from the beginning in 1990, we see a political kind of map being drawn for East Germany that is pretty much in place today to some extent, and that is that all of the states went heavily for the CDU, with the exception of Brandenburg. So the five East German states are Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, Mecklenburg-Western Pomerania in the north, then you have Saxony-Anhalt here, Brandenburg, Thuringia, and Saxony. And of course, there's a sixth state technically, which is East Berlin. East Berlin combined with West Berlin to make the current state of Berlin. So there are five East German states, new Bundesländer as they're also called, and then East Berlin, which is integrated into West Berlin. So technically 5.5 East German states that became part of the German Federal Republic, all with their own elections and different political environments. But as we can see here, that in Saxony, Thuringia, Saxony-Anhalt, and Mecklenburg-Western Pomerania, the CDU was clearly the largest party, winning not only over 50% in many areas, but winning almost all of the districts, including the cities that went slightly more for the SPD. And to some extent. However, there was one exception, that was Brandenburg, and this is even true today. Brandenburg became a stronghold for the SPD in 1990, and the SPD has remained strong in the state, even though they've become weakened. They have been able to win elections back to back on the state level, and then of course you see the purple is the PDS, that is the predecessor to Die Linke, the successor to the SED. They won in the middle parts of East Berlin, which up until recently, up until the collapse of Die Linke and the rise of the BSV, was the stronghold of the party in some of the suburbs known as Lichtenberg or Marzahn in the middle of East Berlin, where they are very strong. There's very high support for the East German government. Even the approval of the state of East Germany was very high in these regions, with a lot of the older voters, people in their 60s, people that had grown up with East Germany, even though they weren't necessarily all communists or all PDS voters. A lot of them had a higher approval rating or higher support of the East German state and its effectiveness than West Germany, because some of the problems after German unification. They did change with the youth, but we see, as we were going to see, there are still political divides between the east and west. The PDS also did some, well in Mecklenburg, Western Pomerania, in the part on the east, which is of course Pomerania. And this basically set the lines for what would happen in the East German states. So now I want to take a look at the way each of the states voted in its state elections. Of course, the elections for the entirety of East Germany were held in 1990, and by the end of the year, the reunification had effectively happened. The East German legislature had allowed East Germany to be integrated into the Federal Republic. The Federal Republic, the Bundestag in Bonn, had approved it, and they became one country. And then there was new elections held for the Bundestag, including the East German states. And then, of course, there were also the individual state elections for the 5 states that had now become part of the country. And, of course, 3 of these states, Saxony, Thuringia, and Brandenburg, are holding their state elections on this month. 2 of them being September 1st. Those are Saxony and Thuringia, and then Brandenburg on the 22nd. So I want to take a look at the way these states have voted historically, so we can see, what the background is, the way these states have been in the past, to see how, drastic the results we are. Because the results we're going to get on Sunday are definitely going to be interesting, but it's going to be even more interesting when we look at how these states have voted in the past. Now, if we start out with Saxony, Saxony was from the beginning a very, very big stronghold for the CDU, even almost more strong, as strong as Bavaria was for the CSU, or CDU-CSU on the federal level. Saxony, from the beginning, had a CDU absolute majority. This means the CDU alone had enough seats in the legislature, the Landtag, to govern the state alone. And this was true from 1990 up until 2004. And even in 2004, when they suffered heavy losses, they were still the largest party by a long range, by around over 20 points. And even today, as they have dropped and lost some support, and you see the rise of the AfD, they are still the largest party, and even now polling as potentially being the largest party in the state. But what is very interesting, in a lot of these states, a similar thing happened, was that as the problems with East German unification became more and more apparent, there was a resurgence for Die Linke, or the PDS. There was a kind of higher approval, not necessarily people going back to the Die Linke that were necessarily hardcore communists or socialists, but there were a lot of problems that were not addressed by unification. A lot of people started to see that the life in East Germany was better than in West Germany. Not everyone, but there was a substantial amount of the population that felt that way, and that kind of drove Die Linke to surging in the 90s when unemployment in East Germany rose. And there was a time where the unemployment in some East German states was around 20-25%, but in West Germany it wasn't as bad. So there were deep economic problems in the East that drove people to voting for a party like Die Linke. They wanted to return to the past, even if it had some issues, even if they didn't have as much freedom as there was kind of an economic stability, and that drove some of the voters. So we see Die Linke was able to surge. And in 1994, they overtook the SPD as the main left-wing party. So although they never overtook the CDU, they were never able to put forward a governor. They did manage to overtake the SPD to assert themselves as the main opposition party, the main left-wing party in the state. And this is true in pretty much all the states, with the exception of Brandenburg in the 1990s. We also see the Greens and the FDP here getting around 5%, every election. It was very difficult for the Greens and FDP to win above 5% at every election. They were kind of seen as West German parties that were very popular amongst the middle class in Western Germany, but they struggled a lot in the East. With the Greens, of course, did okay in some of the cities, but even there, it was very difficult for them to win enough support to compete with the other parties. And of course, later on, you see in 2014, the AfD came onto the scene. They were founded in 2013, so at this election, they only got around 10%. But of course, the migration crisis and other things led to a rise of the party, for them going up to 27%, asserting themselves second place. So in one election, we see a very different change. But overall, you can see that the CDU has dominated this state, and this is why I want to take a look at this chart, is because on Sunday, it is kind of up in the air who's going to win. We could see the CDU continue this trend and hold the state for another 4 years, making it effectively 40 years of CDU, or 35 years of CDU governance. And on the other hand, we could see the AfD win, and this would be the first time since ever, for this iteration of Saxony, that a party other than the CDU has won. Of course, there were elections in Saxony in the Weimar Republic and before then, but that was a very different time, completely different political environment, and there was a lot of trends there that were completely opposite of what we see now. So Saxony, very interesting, whether or not the CDU will hold on for another 5 years, or the AfD will win and flip this state to another color for the first time in its history. Now, the next state we're going to look at is Thuringia. Now, Thuringia was somewhat similar to Saxony. The CDU was very strong here, and early on, they were basically at an absolute majority. Whether or not, they could either win over 50% and govern on their own, or they were very close to that and would govern with the FDP or SPD, having enough support to basically ensure that they would, hold the governorship. And we see another interesting situation here. I mean, very similar to Saxony with the dynamic of the left and the SPD. From 1990, Die Linke was the PDS was only around 10%, but as the issues with East Germany started to, come to the forefront, we saw them rise to around 16%, then 21%, then around 26%. So in 3 consecutive elections, they rose and then kind of, leveled off around the mid 2000s. But they were able to overtake the SPD in 1999, asserting themselves once again as the main left-wing party in the state, the main opposition party. And what's interesting about Thuringia is they had a very effective branch under Bodo Ramelow, which became leader in, I believe, the early 2000s. He was their lead candidate and eventually became governor. And what is very interesting about Thuringia is Die Linke never collapsed here like they did in the other states. And because they had a very effective branch, they were able to put themselves forward enough to, actually create and form and lead a government. And so they actually grew, and I'm not sure, but I believe this might be a record, but they were able to grow and increase their support in 6 consecutive elections. So the Die Linke, or the PDS in Thuringia, has never lost support in an election. From 1990 up until 2019, in every election, they got a higher percentage of the vote than in the previous election. Of course, that is not going to be the case this time. They are polling at only around, 14, 15%, half of what they got last time. So they are going to see a big dip. But nonetheless, they are faring a lot better than Die Linke is in other states. And we can see that, of course, contrary to Saxony, the CDU here completely collapsed in 2019. They went from being the largest party in every single state election until then to, in one, going from first place down to third, getting beat by Die Linke by a large margin, and, of course, by the AfD by around 1.5 points. Now, what's interesting is that in this kind of scenario, for 2024, it's kind of up in the air who is going to come in second. The AfD is likely going to win the election, and then the CDU will most likely come second, but the BSV could end up beating them. So the CDU obviously is still an important player here, especially when it comes to forming a government. But they are not as strong here as they used to be. I mean, you look at it in 1999, they were reaching over around 51%, governing on their own, and now they're polling at just over 22%. So definitely a big change. Die Linke itself, which has been very successful in the state, a very big political player. This was their state, the 2019 elections in Thuringia was the Die Linke's strongest, best election result in any state in Germany in its history. And so obviously they are collapsing, a big change. The Die Linke is very strong in the state, but they have not been able to survive the major challenges that have faced the entire party as a whole. And we can also see the SPD is basically become irrelevant in the state. They are still important to forming a government, to being a junior partner, but as for being a major coalition partner, they are not really important. And they were kind of, influential in the 90s, but they have kind of collapsed. And even now in 2024, they're expected to go even further below, and then similar to the other states, the Greens and the FDP are, sometimes in play for maybe winning over 5% and being part of the government or opposition, but they're not major players in these elections in this state either. And the last state we're going to look at, of course, is Brandenburg. Now, Brandenburg is different from the other two in that, as we saw from the 1990 Volkskammer election, Brandenburg became a stronghold for the SPD. Now, the reasons for this are somewhat interesting. It's very contrary to what it was historically, because if you look at the maps, if you look at the elections in the Weimar Republic and before World War II, Brandenburg was somewhat more conservative, and Saxony was actually somewhat more of a stronghold for the SPD. And it's kind of hard to determine what exactly happened, but it is important to note that this was, a huge gap. I mean, there were no elections held in Brandenburg and Saxony between 1933 and 1990. So there was, a lot of decades where there were a lot of changes in the population, in the political environment. I mean, they went through 3 different iterations, 3 different regimes and countries, and so a lot changed. And so the historical trends didn't really survive, and you can't really see them being reflected here. But we see Brandenburg, stronghold of the SPD. In 1994, they won around 58%. You can see how left-wing the state is compared to Saxony. Not only did the SPD win an absolute majority by a huge margin, Die Linke, or the PDS rather, came on par with the CDU, meaning you had the SPD at around 58%, and then the PDS and the CDU at around both 18%. So with a left-wing party around 60% and a party to the left of them around 20%, almost winning second place. And we see this was an interesting scenario where you have the same dynamic with Die Linke rising as the main opposition party, but instead of it being overtaking the SPD, it was overtaking the CDU. And that did happen almost in 1994, but in 2004 and 2009, they did do very well. There was actually a chance in 2004 that their lead candidate, Dagmar Enkelmann, would become the governor. In some polls, they were winning the election. However, they did end up falling short and only won second place, albeit with major gains. And in 2009, the same thing happened. So Die Linke was able to, do very strong here. And actually, before Bodo Ramelow became governor, this was the strongest state for Die Linke, at least at the statewide level for the elections. Them winning around 28% was a very good showing. And the CDU kind of fell below that, second place. And then there was a time in the late 90s, early 2000s where this was a very left-wing state. You have two left-wing parties competing for first and second place. And that, of course, is very comparable to the way Saxony is now between the CDU and the AFD. Of course, that has completely changed since the AFD came online as a political force. And the Die Linke suffered heavy losses. They dropped around 8 points in 2014 and then another 8 points in 2019. So they've fallen from their high of around 28-29% in 2004. And of course, in this election, 20 years after that, they're expected to fall below the 5% threshold, losing all representation. Now, it is interesting because it is significant that Die Linke, which has been, of course, a major player in these states, has been the second largest or largest party in all three, is going to be completely wiped out. But in term, they're not necessarily going away. The BSV, although not is not the exact same as Die Linke, it is, of course, founded by former members of the PDS in Die Linke. It is led by Sarah Wagenknecht, who is from East Germany. So in a way, the BSV is replacing Die Linke. That's not exactly true, but it is the case. So it's not as simple as that Die Linke is disappearing from the East German political landscape, but rather a new iteration of Die Linke led by a different wing of the party is replacing them, and Die Linke is kind of falling out. So that is interesting, and we will see how the BSV does in this state. But as you can see, similar to the other two, the AFD rose to second place. So we see in Saxony and Thuringia, we see the CDU and the AFD competing, and then of course in Brandenburg it is the SPD and the AFD. But there are trends that are true in all three states. The incumbent parties, the CDU and the SPD, have fallen. They are not as strong as they were in the past. They are nowhere near winning an absolute majority. And the minor parties, the Greens, the FDP, haven't been able to make gains. It's you have a lot of younger voters that have grown up, voters that have not been born in East Germany but were born in the new Federal Republic that can now vote. Been able to vote for years, and still then the Greens and FDP weren't able to really break through. In 2019 and 2021 in some of the elections, they were able to do well in East Germany, but that has since kind of faded. And so this is really going to be interesting. These changes will continue, and we can see that there was a complete, new dynamic in East German politics, where it went from a, one dominant party to two opposition parties to being almost 4 or 5 competing for first and second place, all very close at around 15 to 20%. So very interesting, and we'll have to see the way the results play out. But I want to do this video to kind of look at the history of these states, to kind of give everyone a background, to kind of give everyone an idea of how these states have voted in the past and how significant these results are if something happens like the CDU falls to second place in Saxony, or if Die Linke loses all representation in Brandenburg, just how important that is from a historical perspective. So I want to do this video, and that's going to be it before these elections. Of course, when we get the results on Sunday, I will do a quick video covering the raw results, and then probably a deeper dive into both the states. And then, of course, Brandenburg will follow a few weeks after that. So if you do like these videos, please like, share, subscribe, and I'll see you all in the next one. Thank you for watching.